I'm Tyler Reinick, lead videographer.
And I'm Jackson Minessale, lead interviewer, and we're here with my grandfather, Carmelo Minessale, in his house, conducting an oral history on May 7th, 2018, in Brookfield, Wisconsin. Hello, Mr. Minessale. How are you doing today?
Good evening.
All right,
Great.
so we just start off talking about your early life a little bit. So,
Sure.
where did you grow up, and who lived in your household growing up?
Okay, well, I kind of had a unique early life in the sense that I grew up in Milwaukee, and my first home was on 14th and Keefe. But the nature of the whole situation, when you say who did I live with, was that my mother passed away at birth. My mom and dad were both, we were post-war babies, and I have a twin sister. And when we were born, my mother passed away 2 days later. And my dad then had the responsibility of raising us. He did so, as I said, on 14th Street, but my maternal grandmother came to live with us. That was in 1949, and she ended up living with with us and then with my parents until 1976 when she passed away. So she was a part of our family all along. It was my dad and my grandmother and the two of us until 1952, when my dad remarried, and he remarried my mother's sister. Basically, she is the only mother that I knew, because at that point we were only 2.5 years old. But so then, moving forward, it was my dad and my mother, who was also my aunt, but my mother and my grandmother and my sister Natalie and I.
Okay, so how would you say, was it awkward at all for you being raised by your aunt, or would you say that she did a pretty good job picking you up?
Oh, she did a great job. I mean, I knew as I said, I knew no one else. I mean, to me, she was my mother. I never thought of her as a stepmother or anything. She was the only mother that I truly knew. So yeah, she did an awesome job. She just passed away a year ago at the age of 103. Sure. So she was a member of our lives for a long, long time.
Very long life she lived. So what was it like living with your grandmother? What type of influence did she have on your upbringing, would you say?
Well, okay, that was interesting. I mean, my grandmother spoke a broken English. When she was talking to my parents or other people, most often she spoke Italian. She came here from Sicily, probably just early 1900s, maybe around 1908, 1909. So she still spoke very much of a broken English. So people always say that when we started school, my sister and I, we spoke kind of a broken English also. We'd say things like uppy stairs and things. It was very different, because so much of the time during the day, she was with us all the time, and that's how she spoke, so we spoke that way also. But she was just a very, very, very important part of our life, and she was a great cook. So I was always a pretty big boy.
That's good. So, did you speak Italian then? Was that your first language kind of growing up, or?
Not really. My sister and I never really spoke the language. We understood it more and more as time went by, but very little. I mean, other than saying a word here, a word there, we didn't speak the language like my parents did. Again, my parents did not come from Sicily. They were born here, but again, because their parents only spoke Italian to them early on, they spoke fluent Italian on both sides of the family now. I'm talking about my mother's side and my dad's side.
Makes sense. So, could you talk a little bit more about your relationship with your twin sister? What was it like growing up with a twin? And
Well, she was my best friend. She was, we shared, back then you didn't have huge homes, and we shared a bedroom with I shared bunk beds and a bedroom with my sister, and my grandmother was in that room.
Oh, wow.
Right. So it was a crowded room. Until 8th grade, we were in every single class together. I mean, she was the person I played with all the time. We had a very, very, very close relationship throughout our lives.
Wonderful. So you seem to have been talking a lot about family. Would you say that family played, a pretty big role in your life? Like, can you talk about maybe your extended family, how
Sure.
they kind of played into your upbringing?
My father came from a family of 10. My mother from a family of 9. Only 4 of them, or 5 of them, 6 of them got to adulthood. one being my mother who passed away in her 30s, and the other being my uncle who was killed in Iwo Jima. So on my mother's side of the family, I had 4 aunts and uncles. On my dad's side of the family, there were 9 aunts and uncles. Our whole life was our family. The Italian family was unique in that if you'd asked me about my friends or who I spent my time with, it was our family. We did everything together with our cousins. Beyond my sister, my closest friends were my cousins. We did everything with them. It seemed like there was a birthday party every other night growing up. But they were, they helped raise us. I had kind of have a unique privilege the last couple decades that I've done eulogies for almost every one of my aunts and uncles. Mm-hmm. And I've always talked about the village that raised my sister and I, because even though I did have, my grandmother and my dad did a great job, and my aunt mother, let's put it that way, were wonderful. I was really raised by a lot of people, especially those first couple of years. My aunts and uncles were such an important part of it, and I had the opportunity at all of their eulogies to kind of talk about in each case what they meant to me in my life. So it was my extended family, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins really were our life. They were our best friends. They were our social group. We did everything with them.
So besides the closeness of you to your family, that it sounds like you were pretty close. Mm-hmm. Would you say there were any other parts about you growing up Italian that might differ from someone else of a different ethnic background growing up in this country? Well,
okay, I think, obviously, and I don't know if one big thing was always the fact that we had Sunday dinner. We had pasta, we called it basta, the Sicilian slang, but we had basta dinner together every Sunday. Early on, it may have been down at my grandfather's house or at one of my aunt's houses. Once we, even grew older, it was, when we had our own children, it was still very often every Sunday you had dinner together. But also, I think one thing unique about our Italian family is that so much of what we did was also centered around our church. It seemed like with the Italian groups that they came here, like ours came from Sicily. They came from a couple of different locations in Sicily. And they migrated here to the east side of Milwaukee and centered around 2 churches. First, the Our Lady of Pompeii Church. I had a book here about that I can show you later, pictures of it. But Our Lady of Pompeii Church, and then eventually, once it was knocked down, also St. Rita's Parish. They were 2 Italian parishes. And there were what they call societies, which were just social groups, but they were based on families that came from Sicily, many of which married each other, such as my mom and dad coming from the same area and marrying through the church relationships. Now, it didn't go to our generation, but the generation before, many were centered around the church and the societies and the different activities, the festivals that they had.
So would you say there is definitely a different feel to going to Sunday Mass at an Italian community church than there is today where you go now? And maybe could you describe?
Well, I think because they were older churches, and I've gone to newer churches the last few, probably 3-4 decades, mm-hmm. There were just many more relics. There were many more relics that were in the church, statues and things. Obviously, it was pre-Vatican too, so there was a lot of 1 and 2. So there was a lot of differences with the altars and things like that. It was a much different feel to it. But again, very often, right after church, everyone went down to the church hall downstairs, and there was a community together that happened.
So obviously, Our Lady of Pompeii Church mm-hmm. is no longer there. It was removed to make way for the highways down in Milwaukee. Do you remember when that happened? Like, how did you feel about that? Was that controversial for you at all, or did you understand the necessity for it? Or what was your thoughts?
Okay. It was done, I think, around the year I graduated from high school. I think around 1967 they actually demolished it. But by that point, for whatever reasons, it wasn't. We had transferred over to St. Rita's already.
Oh, okay.
We had transferred. Basically, I was born in 1949. Both my parents marriages were at Our Lady of Pompeii. We were baptized at Our Lady of Pompeii, but by the middle 50s, we transferred over to St. Rita's. And we had our confirmation, First Communion, First Eucharist. My sister was married at St. Rita's. So it was a little easier for us to see what was happening and not be as affected by that. I think that my parents were a little, felt that, but we didn't as much.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Was there a reason your family transferred to St. Rita from Our Lady of Pompeii?
I'm sorry, but I really don't know. That's a good question. And it would be, there's no one I can ask anymore about that, but I really don't remember why that was, except that my grandfather lived about 2 blocks away.
Oh, okay.
So I think once they built St. Rita's and it was a vibrant parish, I think the fact that it was so close to my grandfather's home may have had something to do with it.
That makes sense.
Yep.
So where did you go to elementary and grade school growing up?
Okay, I was as opposed to my wife, I was a public school student. I went throughout all of, even through graduate school and all, I went to public schools. Mm-hmm. I started at Keefe Avenue School, which was over on about 16th and Keefe. I was there from kindergarten through half of 6th grade. From there, once we moved to the northwest side of town, to 65th and Hampton, Stark area, I then went to Lancaster School, and for just a half a year. I then went to John Muir Junior High School, which was off of 72nd and Silver Spring. It's now Cameron. I think it's called Carmen, the Carmen High School. Mm. And I was there for middle school, for high school, or junior high school, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. Then I went to Custer High School, off of Sherman and Hampton area, Villard. Custer High School, graduated from there in 1967, went on to UWM, and was there for a long, long time for my undergraduate, my graduate, and I even taught there for about 16 years part-time. But it was all public education for me.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, so I'd just like to touch base a little bit more on your before high school education.
Sure.
Just kind of the grade school time period. Were you involved in any kind of school-sponsored activities back then? Or?
Well, when I think of grade school, I was involved in scouting. I have a picture that I can give to you about when I was I was in a Scoutorama, and it was Indian folklore. You'll see that I'm the good-sized drummer in the lower left corner of the lower corner of that. So I was always actively involved in scouting in terms of in grade school. Wasn't involved in a lot of other things simply because I had some health problems with my legs, so I couldn't do a lot in the way of athletics. But we also didn't do a lot of outside things, which is different now because you did so much with your family.
Yeah.
You didn't want things to be taking up your time because we were with family, extended family so much.
So as far as scouting went, do you have any memories that stick out in your mind of favorite experiences? Or?
Well, this was one of them. When I was an Indian drummer, I really enjoyed that. I never got, when I say scouting, I was a Webelow, I was a Cub Scout, a Webelow, and I just started with Boy Scouts. Sure. I never got into the camping end of it. That was never my part of it. So it was early scouting. Let me just put it that way. It was early scouting. Okay. Not once I'd left Keefe Avenue School and went over to Lancaster and things, I never did any more with scouting.
Mm-hmm. So outside of scouting and spending time with family, what did kids your age do when you were growing up? Like, how did you kind of spend an afternoon on a weekend?
Oh, that's interesting. I'm trying to think. We played outside. Mm-hmm. Okay. There were a few, if there were neighbors, you played with neighbors. If we were inside, we played a lot of board games, the Monopolies, the Clues, the all-time favorite type. We played a lot of board games. Didn't get to watch a lot of TV. We had a black and white TV set, but my father pretty much said TV was watched for a little while after supper. We didn't do a great deal of TV watching. That I can say for sure. We played a little bit of sports, but it was mainly just playing with friends. I played with Army men all the time. I had little Army men, and we set up little battles because the war was still a very memories of the war and thoughts of the war. We played a lot of Army together, as they called it.
So one last question I have that I believe happened during the time period of when you might have been in grade school. Do you remember when Milwaukee got a professional baseball team, or perhaps when they won the World Series?
Yeah, I remember that very well. In terms of I don't remember per se when they came back, because I was very young when they came back from Boston, or came from Boston, I should say, not back. I remember when they came back later. But I remember the day that they won the World Series like it was yesterday. I had to go downtown for an eye appointment. I used to see an eye surgeon, and I would go down there every month or so. And I was on the bus the day that they won the World Series. And I'll never forget how frightened I was when I didn't know what had happened, but how frightened I was when people were running into the streets as I was going down Wisconsin Avenue on this bus, and there were people everywhere. So that's my memory of the World Series, is just as a little kid. I was, 8 years old at the time, how nervous I was about that. I can tell you one of my greatest experiences with the Braves, just a little sidebar, and this was obviously after the World Series, but my claim to fame is that I got to go and sit in a box seat when the Braves played the Dodgers. Now, this won't mean a lot to you, but to others it would. The pitchers that day for this doubleheader in the box on a Sunday afternoon, the Brewers had Warren Spahn and Lou Burdette pitching against Don Drysdale and Sandy Koufax. To this day, that might have been my greatest afternoon of baseball ever. And I wasn't too old, I was a little older than obviously that, but it was great.
Yeah, I've heard of Koufax and Spahn for sure. But
right. They were all great.
So when you say that, so was it kind of like you paid for a ticket to one game and you just got to stay at the stadium for the whole
They
game?
had doubleheaders, which we don't have to have doubleheaders anymore because we're not going to have cancellations or anything else because we have a roof over us now at Miller Park. But back then, you probably had 3, maybe 4 doubleheaders together, maybe some on the road, some here each year. And some were caused by rainouts, some were just already on the schedule. So, yeah.
All right, so if we could move on to your high school career. So you said you went to Custer High School in Milwaukee. Was it your choice to go there, or was it just kind of you went to the neighborhood high school and that's that?
Yeah, I mean, in our case, it was you just went to the neighborhood high school. You were going to go to public schools, and that was the neighborhood high school, and we went there. Some of a new high school had just opened up at that time, John Marshall, and depending on what side of the street you're on kind of thing, some went to Marshall and some went to Custer. It was a very close dividing line there, but yeah, there was no question where we were going. Back then, we really didn't talk about or even have the money to talk about private schools. We went to the public schools.
So your sister went to Custer with you as well, I'm assuming. Did you have a favorite subject in high school, and maybe why was that your favorite subject?
Oh, I'm kind of different in this regard in that I, from 8th grade on, wanted to be a math teacher.
Oh, wow.
So I love math. Now, I'm not saying I was a math genius. I wasn't, but I loved math. So math was always my favorite subject in high school, and yeah, it was.
So you knew that early on that that's what you wanted.
From 8th grade. I never had an extra credit in college that I had to worry about. I went right through with my understanding that I was going to become a math teacher, and it was the best thing I ever did. But at the same time, it was my favorite subject too in school.
What made you kind of think that this is what I love and this is what I want to do with the rest of my life? Was there a moment that you could pinpoint where?
It was a combination of two things. It was the number one that I had. I talked to you about all my aunts and uncles. One of them went to college. My dad's youngest brother went to college, and he was a math teacher. And my dad really always looked up to him. If we ever had any questions about things related to schooling, he was the one I called. And I just had great respect for him as a person. So I think that started. And then in 7th and 8th grade, my math teacher was one of my uncle's football from the same football team with my uncle at UWM. They played together, and he was a really great math teacher also. So I think the two of them together kind of locked it for me. By 8th grade, I was sure I was going to be a math teacher.
Oh, wow. I mean, it's funny you say that. I didn't even know UWM had a football team.
Back then they did, yeah. They even had it when I was a student. Not that I played it, but till about 1968, they had a football team.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did not know that.
Yep.
So, while we're on the topic, did you play any sports in high school? Were you involved?
Yeah. By the time high school came, I finally could play sports because I had something called a club foot and really did not I was under treatments pretty much summers before that. But when I got to high school, I was a wrestler and a football player. Not great at either of them, but I was just so excited to be able to be involved in team sports and things again, which I couldn't do before. That those were my two sports.
Sure.
Yep.
Were there any memorable games for football or wrestling matches that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, my most, not so much for football, because I didn't get into too many of those games. My most memorable wrestling match had to be my senior year in the city tournament.
Got it.
I was, at that time, representing our team as the 180-pound candidate, and because they seeded according to your abilities at that point, I was going up against the number one seed in the tournament.
Oh.
So you can tell where I was seated. And you come out to meet your opponent, and as I got out there, the other gentleman from Washington High School did not appear. And we waited and waited, and the referee said, where's the other one? They found out he was sick in the locker room. And I said, well, I'll wait. And my coach said, no, we're not waiting. We're done. So I won my first match in the city tournament. That was the only match I won in the tournament, but I did win that match.
Sounds like he was pretty intimidated, didn't want to fight you.
that might have been it, I think, yeah. So that was quite an experience.
So besides sports, was there anything else you were involved in high school, or was sports in school?
I was president of the National Honor Society, so I coordinated the National Honor Society activities that we had during the year, fundraisers and things like that. I was in the Letterman's Club because I did earn a couple of letters in high school.
So, I'm sorry, could you explain what the Letterman's Club?
Letterman's Club was just simply all men. At that time, there was no female sports. That didn't come till later.
Yeah.
So it was all the fellas that had earned letters, varsity letters, were in a club. And again, they do some fundraising activities and things like that. But beyond that, you just had to earn a varsity letter in any of the sports.
Okay. And what sport did you?
I finally earned letters in football and wrestling.
Oh.
Yeah, not till my senior year, but yeah, that. But those were the two major. Because I was in sports then too, and sports took up a lot of time, but so I didn't have time for a lot of the clubs. I was on student council also, student government. I forgot about that. I was also in student government too.
Did you have a title in your student
I was
government?
just a class officer. Like each level had a class officer.
Okay.
Ran for class president, but for student council president, but lost. But,
it happens.
That happens,
What were your duties and responsibilities as a class officer?
You just basically would meet with the class and find out what their concerns were, and you'd have time to meet with them, and then take that to the council as to whatever it might be. That's all.
Sort of a representative.
Exactly,
class.
you're a representative for them. Yep.
Did you have a job, an after-school job, while you were in high school? Or?
No, I didn't. I was, I guess, very lucky in that regard. In terms of through high school, I never really had a job. I really didn't.
Okay. So, one more thing I wanted to touch base on that was, I believe, occurred around the same time that you might have been in high school was the Milwaukee race riots. Was that around the same time?
Okay, actually, the race riots in Milwaukee occurred the summer after my graduation in 1967.
Oh, okay.
It was interesting during that time. We would always, with our entire family, extended family, we would go to northern Wisconsin, to outside of Eagle River, and we would vacation for 1 week every year. And that summer, when we were coming home, about to come home, we were notified that there was a quarantine. You were not allowed to get back into the city of Milwaukee. It didn't last for many days, but it lasted for a little while, where we had to stay at our vacation home up there. We had to stay in that area. We could not get back into the city. They weren't allowing people back into the city. So beyond that, when I got back, I wasn't directly involved in that. I heard stories from some friends that were in the National Guard, and they had to deal with issues. One thing I think would be interesting to just mention, my cousin was a National Guardsman. And, basically for them it was summer camp every year, and you kind of prepare for things, but never really had gone anywhere.
Yeah.
Well, he talks about driving down 3rd Street, now Martin Luther King Drive in Milwaukee, driving down 3rd Street in the back of a truck, open truck, with his rifle drawn, and they were looking in windows for snipers.
Oh, wow.
And how he said, how his heart was pounding and thinking that this was his city that he grew up in, and now he was aiming a rifle into windows. Now, he never had to shoot the gun or anything, but that was very moving for us to even think about that.
It would be a pretty intense experience.
Right.
Could you tell that in the city of Milwaukee there was kind of some tension leading up to the riots in the city?
Sure. I mean, we had the Father Grappi walks where they, over the viaducts where they wanted fair housing.
Yeah.
There were things going on. I mean, I experienced some of what was happening in Milwaukee in the sense that, if you look at this picture I was showing you earlier, that from my grade school, I was, and it's hard to tell there because I know a lot of us had makeup on, but really I was in a very integrated grade school.
That kind of struck me.
I was in a very integrated grade school with no problems. There were no problems, racial problems whatsoever that I remember ever, fights or anything. But yet, there were concerns, and when we moved, I have to admit this because I do remember this even though I was young, when we moved from 14th and Keefe because our parents and parents around the area were worried about their home values because many blacks were moving into the area.
Sure.
And although you could walk outside at night and there was never a problem, we got along very well in the neighborhood, my father moved just because he was worried about the value of his home. And so when I moved to 65th Street and we talk about, the racial tension and all that, I moved to, this is my graduation picture in 1963, 3 years later, at John Muir Junior High School. I don't know, there's 100 and some people on that picture.
Yeah,
and there are maybe 3, maybe 4 blacks that are in that class.
Yeah.
So we saw what was happening in the city of Milwaukee, even though we did not have the problems. I experienced much more racial tension, and maybe we can talk about this later or whatever, when I got into the teaching profession, and we could talk about some of that. But I wanted to show you with these two pictures, and it wasn't really that many years between my Indian folklore picture was probably 1958, I'm going to say, around there, and this was 1963. So we're talking 5 years difference and what it kind of had gone on. And my Custer picture would not have been any different than my John Muir picture.
I see.
Yep.
Would you say as a family the tension was a big part of your lives, or was it just kind of something that didn't really affect you personally?
Honestly, it didn't affect me personally. There were other things that were going on at the time in the 50s that probably affected us even more, that in terms of a family being fearful. I'll tell you a number, and I'm just going to mention these real briefly, but not to downplay what was going on with race, but in the middle 50s, we had a polio epidemic in America, and it was also in Milwaukee. Two instances where it affected me. Well, one where it affected me was the fact that my cousin got polio. She lived, but I can remember we were lined up. At that time, you didn't only have doctors' offices. Doctors had offices in their home. One Sunday afternoon, our entire cousins and aunts and uncles were lined up on a city block outside of this doctor's home. And we were around the corner even, there were so many of us, and we were all going in for the polio vaccination.
Oh, wow.
On a side note with that, it didn't affect me at that time because I didn't know her, but my wife, her brother passed away from polio during that epidemic. But all of us were very fearful of it because you talked about it in the schools all the time. So when you talk about a fear or something that was, would bother you as a young child, that was it. Sure. One was polio, and the other was in the 50s, the Cold War. The Cold War was going on, and everybody had, we had in our second home by 1960, we had a bomb shelter in our basement. It was a fruit cellar that my father reinforced, and we kept food down there, kept water down there. People were very concerned about the Cold War and what Russia would do to us. I would say those were the two major tensions for a young child that affected us more, being polio and also the Cold War, than the race riots did, because we were, even when we were, like I said, at Keefe Avenue School, we had a very nice, a very comfortable situation. We got along very, very well.
So I'd just like to touch on something about the Cold War again.
Mm-hmm.
I think people from my generation kind of get the idea that, well, you mentioned the bomb shelters.
Right.
I think people tend to think that it wasn't everyone who was super sort of nervous about an attack from Russia, or was it that way? Was this a very real reality for everyone? Where
I think it was very much of a reality. I think it was very much of a reality. Can I tell you how many did or didn't? I don't. Did everyone have a bomb shelter per se? No. But I mean, even in the schools every day, you had drills, places you had to go. Throughout the city, there were places that you would have, if you were in a particular building, they showed that they had shelter areas if you were going in those buildings, department stores, or whatever else. So I think it was very much of a real reality.
So was this always something that was kind of in the back of your mind
Sure.
growing up, would you say?
Yes. As a young child, those were things you were worried about because you saw it on TV.
Mm-hmm.
Your parents were talking about it. And again, you see my mother changing the water in the shelter downstairs every few weeks and things like that.
Wow.
Or my dad saying, "I bought this to put in the shelter." Those kind of things bothered you. Yeah.
I guess I never realized
Yeah.
how serious of a matter this was. So just to finish up the whole high school section, have you attended any class reunions? For
Yes.
Custer?
We had a 10-year reunion. We had a 20-year reunion. 35-year. Last year we had our 50th reunion.
Oh, wow.
So we went to those. They get smaller. Yeah, they get smaller and smaller and smaller each year in terms of it for two reasons. Number one, I guess people have moved away and all that, but also people kind of lose the energy to look for everyone.
Okay.
So they weren't, the first couple were large and in ballrooms down at the Pfister or other places.
Oh, wow.
The last one was at a little bar on the Milwaukee River, and maybe 4 or 5 dozen people showed up, and I had a graduating class of 750 people.
In just your class, not
Yes,
the whole.
wow.
Wow.
No, my graduating. There were 3,400 students at the school. There were 750 in my graduating class.
That's crazy.
Yes, I'll give you an example so you can relate to your experience. At Custer High School, I shared a locker with 6 young ladies. I was assigned a locker with 6 young ladies. In the morning,
Quite the ladies' man, I see.
and I wasn't the ladies' man. In the morning, I would try to get into my locker and get what I needed to throw into this little section I had and out of there while they were spraying their hair with hairspray. I mean, you'd hold your breath as you went in there. So it was a different experience. It was a very crowded, a lot of baby boomers.
Yeah,
Lots of baby
I'm sure.
boomers. Yep.
So what was it like attending a school where, did that make a difference in your education? Like, were classrooms crowded to the point where it made it more difficult to learn, would you say?
No.
No?
It's all you knew. You didn't know anything else.
Okay.
I mean,
that
things
makes
have
sense.
changed so much now, but the classrooms were bigger. I will say that. I mean, being an educator in future years, I saw how they made classrooms smaller, for reasons. But our classrooms were large because there were large groups of people, and we didn't know it any differently. We didn't feel like, oh my gosh, we're not getting the attention we need. It wasn't something. It was not an issue.
So it was never an issue like
No.
there's not enough one-on-one time with the teacher. If you needed the help, it was there for the most part, you'd say.
It just got done. I don't know how to tell you that. I mean, it wasn't like there wasn't a lot of outside help that you looked for even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whether they needed it or not, there wasn't.
That
So I
makes
don't know.
sense. Sure. All right, so you were talking a little bit before about how you attended the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
Mhm.
Was there any reason in specific why you chose that university over another one?
To be all totally honest with you, it was for monetary reasons. I had a partial scholarship to Carroll College, but when you looked at the amount of money that it would have still cost at a private school compared to UWM, we were paying. Back then, we paid. My sister and I both obviously had to go. We're going there. We paid $125 a semester.
Oh, wow.
That's what it cost,
What a bargain.
and it was it was very, very difficult to pass that up.
Yeah.
And both of us were going into education, and it was to this day and back then was considered an excellent school of education.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a no-brainer for us.
So your scholarship to Carroll, what was that for? Was it an
Academic, yeah.
Oh.
Definitely was not athletic.
Yeah.
It was just purely for academics.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you apply to any other universities besides
No.
those two?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I really didn't.
So it's a pretty easy decision for
Right,
you.
right. And I think a lot of people were that way back then. Most people did not go from the east to the west coast and check out all these different schools. Most people, I'm not saying they all stayed home, but I'm just saying that most people had a reason where they were going to go and had their mind made up fairly quickly.
So for you, was college always part of the plan, or did you kind of get the sense that this was a very unique opportunity for you to be able to go to college, or was it always just something that you knew you were going to go to college? And
I knew that my parents wanted me to go to college. I wanted to go to college, but it was it was just, except for my uncle who had gone. I told you had gone to college. No one else in the family had gone. I had a couple of older cousins that went to college, but everyone did not. A lot of them went in, it was very much of a blue-collar town, and even some of my cousins went to work in the factories and things. And because I wanted to be a math teacher, like I said, from 8th grade on, there was no question I was going to go to college in my mind.
Yeah. So you never, like you said, with so few people in your family going to college, you never took that opportunity for granted, would you say?
No.
So what did you major in?
I majored in math and education. I was in the School of Education, but I had a math major and a social studies or U.S. history minor. So it was a very different combination. I wasn't a science guy. I should have been with math, but it was math and U.S. history.
Was the transition from high school to college difficult for you?
Yeah, it definitely was. I was a very, very good student in high school. National Honor Society, top 10%, blah, 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 not bragging, because what comes next. I went to college, and I found out that if you wanted to, you could play sheepset during the day instead of going to class. So, which I thought was awesome. And my first semester, I had a 2.2 grade point average. And that was it. That was probably the last sheepset I played at the university was the first semester of my freshman year. I had a come to Jesus with my father, and who was financing my education at the time, and the rest of the way was fine. But it was a difficult transition for me. The independence was something I didn't handle real well.
Yeah,
at first.
That makes sense. So did you live on campus, or did you live at home?
We lived at home. It was very much of a commuter school.
Oh.
I'm trying to think, even if they had just a couple little dormitories, but it was very much of a commuter college.
How did you get to school every day then? Was it close enough to walk, or?
No, we took 3 buses every day.
Oh wow!
Yeah, we took a bus over on the corner of Fond du Lac and Hampton. And I forget the numbers anymore. But then from there we took it all the way down to 27th and Hopkins. From there we took a bus down to Oakland Avenue, the corner on Capitol and Oakland, and. I'm sorry, the first bus was on Hopkins and Capitol, and then the second bus. And then we went down Capitol and got the Oakland Avenue bus to UWM. So it was a big commitment. You talk about if you have an 8 o'clock class, you can guess I started our day very early.
How long of a?
Usually could get down there in about 45 minutes to an hour.
Wow.
Yeah, if everything went well. Winters weren't fun, but
I bet.
Yeah, if buses weren't running, but.
So, when you were in college, I believe this was the time in the United States when the Cambodian invasion protests were going on. Did you experience any of that firsthand at UWM, or was that not too big?
Yes, we did. It was that was the spring of 1970. So that was the spring of my junior year that happened, and there were protests at UWM, not as extreme as they were at Madison or even as at Marquette. But basically the protests were to try to shut down the university as non-violently as could be, but there were people always running through the halls, or some would have, they'd get hoses attached and they would start spraying hoses down the hall and all, trying to get people out of the classes. They barricaded the library one day when I was in there and wouldn't let us get out of the library. But there was a lot going on there. there were some good things for us in that some of our classes, professors would come and say, if you were okay with your grade, you don't have to come back anymore, because the professors didn't want to come and try to cross the lines and all that either. I can remember I had one activist math professor for advanced algebra, or abstract algebra it was called, and it really was abstract. He came into our classroom, and there was a lot of protests going on, and he walked in with his long hair, and he looked up at us, and he wrote on the board, "Some students are scabs." And everyone was just kind of shaking, I think, at that point. And right below it, he said, "And some instructors are also." And he just said that he would do what we needed to do. He would, if we were happy with the grade we had, fine. If we needed a better grade and were willing to work for us, he would give us papers or projects to do that. But he didn't want to meet anymore.
Sure.
But he would do that. So a lot of them took it different ways. It was a very upsetting time, because I'd take 3 buses to get down there.
Yeah.
And when I'd get down there, sometimes the classes were canceled. Now, you didn't have email to tell you that classes were canceled. You had nothing like that. So it was just a really unsettling time on campus.
Yeah. So to go back to that,
Yep.
some students are scabs. What was the point he was trying to get across there?
Well, what he was trying to say is that he would have liked if everybody respected the protesters and didn't go to class. He wanted it to be, being called a scab was the fact that you were
Yeah.
crossing, you weren't accepting the protests,
Sure.
and he was just trying to say that but when he said, "and some instructors are also," he was trying to say that he understood, respected our decision, and wanted to help us as best he could.
Okay. I guess what I never really understood was the fact that the protests were meant to keep students out of the classroom.
Well, they wanted us to protest the involvement any way we could. So,
I see.
right.
Were you at all involved in the protests yourself?
I was not. I guess I'll be honest with you. To this day, I'm probably as moderate a individual as there is.
Sure.
I'm not saying good or bad. I'm just saying that's kind of where I came from.
So you just weren't opinionated on the topic
No,
at all?
not as much. I can be honestly say my wife and I recently watched the documentary on the Vietnam War. We watched every minute of it, and I think we learned, even though we both lived through that time, there was so much we did not know. It seemed like we were sheltered from so much of that, maybe because we were not actively involved, but we learned so much from that we had either forgotten or in most cases didn't even know.
So we've talked a lot about some of the experiences you've had in college that might have been a little bit unsettling for you, the whole protest and everything. What were some of your better experiences in college? Like, do you have a favorite memory of going to UWM?
Well, I guess my biggest memory, or the thing that was unique about going to a commuter school, is that I think today a lot of people go to college and go off to college, maybe wherever it might be, and they have a whole new group of friends that they meet that they didn't know before. Because it was a commuter college, so many of my classmates at UWM were also Custer High School graduates. So if anything, all that I did during college was strengthen some of those relationships from high school. I didn't really meet a lot of new people that came from different parts of the state, different parts of the city. A lot of them were my Custer graduates that I just kind of, our relationships became much stronger. But other than that, it was a school that I went to. I did, went for my classes, and I went home. I did not get involved in a single activity at UWM, I can tell you that.
Really?
I'm not saying I didn't like it there or anything. I just, I started working. I did some work at Milwaukee recreation programs. So you'd leave after school and you'd get to work and do some work. But I really did not get involved in campus life at all. Okay. Some of it was because it was a commuter school and there wasn't quite as much as other places. But a lot of it was just because we just had our friends from high school, and we didn't really need to stay down there to do that. You'd leave and go other places.
So you said you got a job for the first time while you were in college. What kind of stuff were you doing at the school?
I helped out with basketball programs at Garden Homes. Garden Homes was a grade school there, and we'd at night and then on weekends, we would run basketball leagues and help organize those. that was my main job, was working recreations. During the summer, I would work playgrounds, summer playgrounds, and coordinate activities at different summer playgrounds that they had. That was I did work one summer as a helper for my uncle who was a mason. I wasn't very good at that.
I'm sorry. What's a mason?
A mason, I'm sorry, a bricklayer. He was a brick mason, and I basically had to carry mud around, which was, the mortar, on a wheelbarrow, and I wasn't the steadiest person in the world, so that was a tough job. But
yeah, sounds like it.
Yeah,
I'm sure I wouldn't enjoy that either.
No, you wouldn't. I guarantee you wouldn't.
So just going back to UWM a little bit, you mentioned that there was a football team at the time. Where did they play? Because I am not familiar with any football.
There's a field down there called Engelman Field. It's now their soccer field.
Oh, okay.
It's now their soccer field. That's where they played. They played on that field. I had a friend from high school, still a good friend today, that played on the team, and I think it was until I'm not positive, but I think it was till 1968, and then they dissolved the program. It might have been a little longer, but it wasn't much longer than that.
Did a lot of people attend these games?
No. No, they didn't.
What about any other sports? Were there any sports that were big at the
basketball was a decent sport at that time, but again, we're not talking about thousands of people. We had a field house, Baker Field House, where a few hundred people could go, and we did have a very competitive basketball team the couple of years that I was there. But again, they didn't play a lot of the big name schools.
Yeah.
But they were very competitive.
Are there any memories you have of that team playing?
No, again, I can remember. The star of the team was Larry Reed. He was, I think, 27 or 28 years old. He had come back from the service and came back to play. He had started college after the service.
Was that common back then? Or?
There were some like that. I don't know how common it was, but there was some, because people would come back on the GI Bill after Vietnam and all. So there was some of that. And then we had a Brad, I forgot his name, was a Custer graduate that played there also. Oh, yeah. But this Larry Reed had the potential to be a pro player. That's how good he was. I don't remember exactly why he didn't at that point, but he was our whole team basically back then.
Gotcha.
Yep.
So what was it like graduating from college and finally receiving that diploma after the end of so mmany years of hard work? What was it like being up on that stage, I presume, receiving your diploma? Yeah,
it was great. Because I was ready to be a teacher. We were lucky in the teaching profession. You're somewhat lucky because you do student teaching ahead of time, so you have a good feel for, what you're going to do later when you graduate. Some engineerings have co-ops, and some other programs have co-ops today. But teaching was always one where the person really knew when they graduated what it was going to be like, because they had the student teaching experience. So I was very much looking forward to it. I have to tell you, not everyone was looking forward to graduation, because at that time there was a draft. And many people that were in college to avoid the draft. Young men were trying to avoid the draft. I had many friends that were doing that. That wasn't my reason for it at that time. I had some physical deformities where I knew that when the time came, I probably would not be going to war.
Sure.
But at the same time, a lot of my friends were there for one reason, and that was for the deferment. And then they, once graduation came, they were worried that they would lose that deferment.
So how did the draft work? Did they just pick birthdays, and if you were...
It was you know how you pick lottery numbers, and they have this bubble machine that picks lottery numbers. They basically had the same thing for birth dates, and they started picking. And if you were the first one picked, you were the number one priority. If it was, my birthday was July 24th. If they had picked July 24th number one, you knew that you were going to be called to the draft as soon as you graduated, because you were number one priority. And then they'd go all the way down to 365. Down to 365, very few people got picked. But if you were in the first 4 or 5 dozen, 6 dozen birth dates that were picked, there was a real good chance that you were going to be drafted.
Wow. So coming out of college, then you said you were ready and excited to be a teacher. Was it easy to find a job right away, or?
Actually, it was for me. It really was. It was just a different time. I think what's so different today is you look today, and when you graduate, your grade point average is so important. I mean, it's so competitive now for any job. I don't mean just education, but for so many jobs now, you're talking about 3.5, 3.6, 3 this, 3 that, to get a job. I'm not going to lie, it wasn't that way. I mean, I think we had to show that we could get a degree, and obviously you can't have failing grades kind of thing, but I think I had like a 3.0 average, and I interviewed for 2 jobs, and I was offered both of them. I was interviewed for the Menominee Falls School District and for the Milwaukee Public Schools. Menominee Falls, as it turned out, I turned them down. Probably was a good idea that I did, simply because it wasn't too long after that, too many years after that, they had declining enrollments, and they lost teachers. Why did I go to Milwaukee? Why did I pick Milwaukee? I think it was just because I had been there all my life. I went to all Milwaukee public schools. I knew the Milwaukee public schools very well, and so I felt I was prepared. I'd done my student teaching at Lincoln High School, so I just understood the schools, and I just felt that was the place I wanted to be.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you talked about you had to interview for the jobs. Was the interview process for you, was it nerve-wracking at all, or was it pretty much smooth sailing all the way through?
It wasn't. It just wasn't. I was nervous going there, but you just met in like a cubicle with one person. It wasn't a team. They asked you some questions for maybe 15 minutes to a half hour at the very most, and a few days later they called, or maybe this next day, I don't even remember, to let you know you had gotten the job.
Oh, wow.
So things were real different then.
Congratulations.
Yeah, you didn't. Yeah, thank you.
So you said you ended up choosing Milwaukee Public Schools in the end. When you apply for a position, do you apply to the school system, or do you apply to a specific school?
Oh, school system. You never get to apply for a specific school.
Okay.
Maybe I can tell you just a little bit about, as it relates to that, my student teaching experience, just real quickly. When I said to you that I was at Lincoln High School, at that time, the semester that I was there, Lincoln High School was running it was basically a student teaching center. They had a few students there from Marquette University, and probably 8 or 9, 10 of us from UWM. And we all taught there at Lincoln High School. And what happened is when we graduated, many of us were offered jobs in Milwaukee, and many of us took those jobs. And they were having a very difficult time at that time in the inner city schools retaining teachers. Teachers would come there, spend a week, a month, maybe a semester, a year at the most, and leave. Because it was becoming more and more difficult because of the racial tensions and things like that. It was starting the inner city schools, which, because there was a seniority system, when you asked about, that's why I'm bringing this up, when you asked about could you pick the school you wanted, Milwaukee was very much built on a seniority system. So you could apply to different schools as you gain seniority.
I see.
So as the newer schools came up, Milwaukee Madison, Milwaukee Hamilton, the older teachers, those that maybe had 20, 30 years experience, they would all go to those schools. Those are some of the nicer schools and all. Whereas the new teachers, many of them were in inner city schools. So what happened is at Lincoln High School, they offered many of us, maybe there were a dozen of us all together, offered many of us jobs in the Milwaukee Public Schools. And what they did is they paired us up so that you were not going to a school with absolutely knowing no one. You at least knew one person from Lincoln High School that in math that you had student taught with.
Yes, that's
okay, this was only in math, not in other areas, but in math.
Oh.
Fortunately for me, the person, when I was given my assignment in the Milwaukee Public Schools at Wells Junior High School, I was paired up with a young lady from Marquette University that would, a couple of years later, become my wife. So, everything about going to the Milwaukee Public Schools was great for me. It was the number one decision of my entire life.
So, you actually touched on something else.
I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No, you're fine. So you said you ended up at Wells Junior High School. That was the first place you started teaching?
Right.
What were some of the challenges? I know you brought up the racial tensions was a challenge for a lot of teachers. In your personal experience, would you say there were any other things that were challenging about teaching at Wells?
Well, first of all, the reputation that the school had, whether it was Wells or Fulton or Roosevelt, Parkman, they didn't have good reputation. So I can tell you this. The Lincoln High School math department was having a reunion right before school started, about a week or two before school started. The day that I was leaving to go to this reunion, my assignment came from Milwaukee as to where I would be teaching. I didn't know until a couple weeks before. I held the letter up to the light, and I saw that I had been assigned to Wells Junior High School. To say I was excited would be a lie. I took it and threw it on the ground. I was not happy about that because I knew it really was going to be a difficult situation. I had been in one at Lincoln High School, so it wasn't like I wasn't prepared for it, but it obviously, it wasn't the most exciting thing. Drove to Racine for this reunion, got down to Racine and saw some of the different teachers. And the thing that made Wells Junior High School best is that day was when I saw my future wife, who I had been student teaching with. And lo and behold, she told me she had got hers that day, and she was assigned to Wells Junior High School. At that point, even though we had no, we were not romantically involved, anything like that, I knew I'd be okay. Because I knew I'd have someone there that I had worked with before, and that was the start. He got there, and there were challenges. It was interesting. The challenges were sometimes with race relations in terms of blacks. At our school, at Wells Junior High School, blacks and Hispanics did not get along. There was a big mixture of blacks and Hispanics in those schools who did not get along. So those caused some problems. We also had the problem that the year that we came in, there were 18 new teachers. And that's what was happening every single year.
Wow.
There were 18 new teachers multiple number of teachers almost every year. So a lot of inexperienced teachers who maybe didn't have the commitment that they wanted to stay there very long. And then here's another fact. 43%, I'll never forget this fact, 43% of the students that started the school year were not there at the end of the school year.
Why is that?
They would transition in and out to go to other schools. They'd go back to, they would get in difficulty in the city, and their parents would take them back to the South to go live with their grandparents or whatever. But there was a constant influx of new students. I'm not saying the enrollment was decreased by 43%. I'm just saying that 43% of the initial students were not there at the end. We might still have a fairly constant population, but it was always evolving.
They were just replaced by new students midway through?
Yes, right. They would come in later. A lot of times, students would come up from the South once the growing seasons were over, and we'd get students for the first time in October, November. Were there challenges? Yes. In math, huge challenges, because there were large deficits in learning.
Yeah, and like you said, with the teachers leaving, that's got to be leaving so constantly. That's got to be tough on the students too. Hard to form relationships.
But we built, for some reason that year, we started building a relationship, especially in our math department. People started to click. And when I say it was frustrating about things, but we really loved what we were doing. We really had a good group of people that we were working with.
Would you say you were able to make a difference in terms of, were you able to reach out to and make a connection with the kids for the most part? Or?
I think we did. Every student, no. But I think we were starting, they saw things happening there, those that had been there before, that weren't happening before. I think we really were starting to make a difference in that school. I was there for 7 years. And I really think the school that we started with and the school we ended with were very different. Well, for other reasons we'll talk about maybe later, but they were very different.
And were the students, would you say, engaged and interested in learning and what you had to say?
Some were, not all. I think I always had a trait in that I was an entertaining person, so I think that helped. But to say that every single student was, no. They had lots of problems back then too. Maybe not as many as some have today, but there were a lot of students that came to school hungry, for one. Or just had, bad home situations, problems, whatever. So did we get to everyone? No, but we tried to get as many as we could.
Yeah, that's too bad.
Right.
So did you teach at Wells in 73?
From 71 to 78, I was there.
So were you at all there for the fire at Wells Junior High School?
Yeah, we had we had a huge fire there in '73, April, I think it was April 10th of '73. There was an enormous snowstorm. I think it's still the largest snowstorm ever in the month of April in the city of Milwaukee. And adjacent to Wells Junior High School was the 18th Street School. We had a little corridor that between the two schools, and the 18th Street School had been used for storage for had been used for storage for a number of years. About midday, the 18th Street School went up in blaze. There was a huge fire. And so they were getting students had to get out of the schools, but they couldn't get fire trucks into the schools because we were supposed to be leaving at noon because of a snow day. There was so much snow coming down. Well, they did get the students out, but it was very difficult to stop the fire because of the fact that the fire trucks couldn't get close to the buildings. So it was on the national news that night. That's how big of a fire it was and how bad the snowstorm was in Milwaukee at the time. I never got home that night. My wife lived, it wasn't my wife at the time, my fiance at the time, lived a few blocks away, and we walked to her place, and I spent the night with her and her roommates because there was no way I was going to get my car out of the parking lot that day. The next day we went back and we were able to get that out. People had taken their snow tires off already by the middle of April there. It was a mess for a few days.
So did you know at all how the fire had...
It just, they don't know. I know they said it had something to do with cleaning materials and things, but I don't know for sure how it started.
So did you teach at a middle school your entire career, or did you ever move up to the high school level?
No, I taught at the middle or this time it was junior high school. I was teaching at a 7th, 8th, and 9th grade school, teaching 7th, 8th, and 9th graders. What happened for me, it was a very unique situation. Our 7th year there, Milwaukee had court-ordered desegregation. And they started to put in a program, our superintendent, Lee McMurrin, started a program of desegregation through with specialty schools. Mm-hmm. And one of the specialty programs he was going to establish was the Gifted and Talented program. And not sure why, but Wells Junior High School became the Gifted and Talented program. Overnight, we became teachers of the Gifted and Talented program.
Oh, wow.
That first year, there was one class at the 7th grade and one class at the 8th grade. That's all there was. The rest of the school was neighborhood students. Yeah. But we had one group of students, 30 students at the 7th and 30 at the 8th. I didn't teach in the program that year. Matter of fact, I was moved out into a math learning center, and I did the school books and counting for the school. So I did not teach that year. But after 1 year, the program was so popular. It was gold to my ear, coming to Wells Junior High School and then moving on to Rufus King's college-bound specialty. Yeah. Became so popular that they moved us to Rufus King. And they decided that we would have a college-bound high school and a gifted and talented middle school, at that time 6th, 7th, and 8th, and then the high school was 9 through 12. And I taught in that 6th, 7th, and 8th school in the gifted and talented program then for the next 5 years. That program and the college-bound program became so popular that the school was growing too much. They needed so many spots that they then took the Gifted and Talented program and moved us to Samuel Morris Middle School. And we then were a 6th, 7th, and 8th grade school standalone at that time. When I say specialty, can I tell you a little about that, or is this? Yeah. What happened for desegregation, what they wanted to do is bring black students to the suburbs and white students from the suburbs into Milwaukee. So and integrate the two programs, the two school systems. To do that, they had to have desirable programs in Milwaukee that students outside the city wanted to come to. Mm-hmm. The Gifted and Talented college-bound program became a huge success. And we'd get students from Whitefish Bay, from Wauwatosa, from various different areas. These were brilliant kids. I had students over that next 12-year period that became USA Today scholars, went on to Harvard, went on to Southern Cal, went on UCLA, Rice, and they were in the newspaper as scholars when they graduated. this became a very successful program. Starting with Golda Meir, they had the elementary students. We would then have we would have the gifted and talented middle school, and then a lot of them would then go to Rufus King for the high school. And it drew students in. And at the same time, we had black students that would go into the suburbs to schools, to Wauwatosa, West Dallas, places like that.
So you make it sound like it was a huge hit at your school, the whole desegregation program. But would you say that it was successful everywhere in Milwaukee, or would you say that it was better because you were teaching the gifted and talented?
Well, I think we were one of the real successes. I do think that the arts program that went on with Elm, Roosevelt, and West Division at the time, that became a fairly successful program. And Washington High School had a computer-based program that became somewhat successful. I don't know that a lot of the other ones, what happened was, I think they were more in name than in actual reality attracting enough students. I think the problem was...
So it kind of stayed still pretty segregated at those schools?
It did. We just never got to the point where there was enough students coming from the suburbs, I felt, to the city. Even in the gifted and talented program, our whole school wasn't completely desegregated. A good portion of it was, but we had a lot of neighborhood students that came also, just because the schools couldn't all be tiny, smaller schools.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, what was your favorite part about teaching? Like, what made you get out of bed in the morning and look forward to going to school? Or did you not get out of the bed in the morning?
Oh, I'm one of these guys that I was up before the alarm would go off, I loved going to school every day. I really did. I enjoyed, until the day I retired, I loved going to school every day. I loved being with students. 8th graders were my passion. I had their mentality. I really enjoyed being with them. I never took anything too seriously. I think I built a repertoire of math jokes and things like that.
Did you hear some of them?
No. But I think I think I was very blessed with the students that I eventually, even at Wells Junior High, I had wonderful students. Most of the students were really excellent, but then getting into the gifted and talented program was a real treat. Some of the, again, brilliant people that I worked with there. I eventually left Milwaukee I'll be honest with you, for monetary reasons, and moved to the suburbs. I was offered a job, which was very unique for me, but I was offered a job outside of Milwaukee in Elmbrook, and I moved there and spent my last 17 years. After 19 years in Milwaukee, I spent 17 years in the Elmbrook schools. And again, I was very blessed. My entire teaching career, I was very blessed with the students that I got to work with.
Would you say you had brighter students in the Elmbrook district or when you were teaching Milwaukee?
There were many bright students in Elmbrook. There's no question about that. But if someone, and I told this to some students at one time, the students that I had at Samuel Morrison and at Rufus King were some of the most brilliant, especially in mathematics, students I had ever met. Not that Elmbrook didn't have them, but Elmbrook had a much more well-rounded student. You found in the gifted and talented program, some of them weren't totally well-rounded. But Elmbrook had much more of that, a student with the whole child kind of, I'd say it, I'll put it that way.
Would you say this was true pre-desegregation too in Milwaukee, or not as much?
Wait, I'm sorry, what do you mean by that?
Would you say that you had brilliant students in Milwaukee before the gifted and talent program as well?
I'm sure they did. I did not have them, simply because at that point, I was at Wells Junior High School. And we had a few unique students that were very good students, but I can't say I had the creme de la creme or whatever you want to call that. I'm not saying they weren't in Milwaukee, because I knew there were students that were. I went to high school with some that were really brilliant, not myself included, but I had some that were.
Sure.
But I didn't get that teaching experience until I got in the gifted and talented program.
So you talked about one of the highlights of you working at Wells Junior High was meeting your future wife.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like meeting her, and do you remember what it was like going out with her at first?
Well, I remember the day I met her, just walking down the hall. She still doesn't remember that day, but I remember that day. It was great working with her because we became friends, close friends, long before we dated. Sure. We didn't date for a number of months, where we worked together and planned lessons together every single day.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so that was, I mean, just a great experience to be able to work, have a best friend who you eventually dated and married. The good and the bad of getting married to her was that Milwaukee had a rule back then that married couples could not work together. So she was at that point, excuse me, she transferred to John Muir Junior High School, which was my former junior high school that I went to. You know, the good news is I was able to marry her. The bad news is that we no longer work together.
Yeah. Is that tough for you?
What's that?
Was it tough for you?
In the beginning, sure. Yeah.
Mm.
But she was going to a very nice experience at that point, so I was happy for her.
And she enjoyed John Muir as well?
I think she did, yeah.
Do you remember your proposal to her? What that was
Proposal?
Like? Were you nervous?
You know, by the time I proposed to her, I really wasn't nervous because I think we both knew that we were ready to be married. So.
And where were you married?
We were married at Immaculate Heart of Mary Church in West Dallas, which was her home parish.
Okay.
Yep.
Do you remember anything specific about your wedding night? Any memories that really?
Please. We were married we had an afternoon wedding and then a reception in the afternoon. So in the evening, we went right back to the church that we were married at, and we went to church that day because we were leaving for our honeymoon the next day. So the pastor looked right up as he was giving us communion. He was like, "What are you doing here?" But we went to church there, and then we went out to dinner. Went out to dinner at a restaurant at right out next to Brookfield Square. It was the Marriott at the time. It had just opened up. The Marriott was brand new, and we stayed there that night and had dinner there that night. Had a wonderful time and left for our honeymoon the next day.
Who was in your wedding party? Like, who was your best man?
My best man was my brother-in-law, Richard,
Okay.
and my sister Natalie was my maid of honor. Yeah, we had a small wedding party. Other than that, we had one of her roommates and one of my first cousins. We didn't have a big wedding party.
Did you have a close relationship with your brother-in-law, Rich?
Yes, I think, as the years went by, I mean, not initially, but as years went by, we did. Because he lived out in Pittsburgh, and because we spent so much time out there, extended time, like when we'd go, we'd spend a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, we did get very close.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So where did you and your wife move into your first home? What was the first
Our
home?
first home when we were married, actually, it was an apartment on 88th and Mill Road. We were there for 1 year.
Okay.
We spent that year there, and then from there, 1 year later, we bought a home on the southwest side of Waukesha on Chapman Drive, and lived there in a ranch-style home for 5 years. I think it was from 74 to 79. And then we built our current home, and we've been here for 38 or 39 years.
I didn't know you built
In the town of Brookfield, yes. Well, I didn't build it with my own hands, but I'm saying my twin sister who lives down the block and we both got subcontractors with the help of my uncle, who was a brick mason, and showed us who to hire and all that, and we basically did it on our own. We didn't go through a builder, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And we've been here ever since.
And you raised your children in this home?
Yep.
Too?
My son Joseph was spent 2 years on Chapman Drive in Waukesha, and right after his second birthday, we moved here, and both of our children were raised here.
And what was it like raising your children? What was having kids for the first time? What was that experience like?
Different. One major reason that was that my wife and I decided, she felt strong about the fact that she would stay home and help raise the kids at home and do some real teaching, as she always said. So we had to go from 2 paychecks to 1 paycheck.
Sure.
That was an interesting experience.
Yeah.
We ripped up credit cards for 7 years, and we made a go of it. After that, I just worked multiple jobs, but we were able to do it, and I have no regrets about it.
What other jobs did you work?
I always, starting by 1981, we moved here in 79. By 1981, the next 16 years or so, I taught evenings at UWM. So I would leave my job during the day, and I would go over to UWM and teach a couple classes a night on Mondays and Wednesdays or Tuesday, Thursdays. So I did that. I also taught in minority programs during the summer at UWM or at Marquette. No, UWM, I think it was only UWM.
Minority programs?
Helping minority students prepare for high school or prepare for college.
Oh, okay.
So you would do tutoring type things. I did that. One program was called Inroads. It was very successful. business-backed program that I worked in. Did that. For about 3 or 4 years, I worked at Century Foods warehouse, Godfrey Foods, and I loaded trucks at night. I would do that. I'd load trucks, and in the summer. During the school year, it was mainly holidays. Thanksgiving, a couple of weeks at Thanksgiving, a month or so at Christmas and Easter, and then summertime. And then later on, towards the end of my teaching career, I became a real estate appraiser and did appraised homes. I worked with a friend of mine, asked me to come along and get some education and see if I wanted to become a real estate appraiser, and I did. And I enjoyed that too.
Was it a lot more education you needed to be?
No, it was a couple of years of going to Waukesha Technical College and taking some classes.
Oh, okay.
And did that and took some national exams and passed those, and I was an appraiser.
Did you, during your time as a real estate appraiser, were there any kind of beautiful homes or interesting landmarks that you got to appraise?
Oh, I saw home. I saw both ends. I saw gorgeous $1 million homes that had indoor basketball courts, indoor pools, to where to crack houses that were burnt out on the inside, and we had to come up with values for these homes. What would it cost to get them usable again? So I was all over the place with that. But I did see some gorgeous homes and some almost not livable homes.
That is interesting. So when did you finally decide that it was time to stop working and retire?
I stopped teaching full time when I was 58. I was having lots of shoulder problems, still am, but I was having shoulder problems, and as a teacher, I used the board a lot, and couldn't do that on a regular basis. I could take ibuprofen and I could get to the board, a few days, maybe 3-4 days a week. The rest of the time, I'd have to get the kids involved in some other activities, small group activities, and I said to myself, now it's time. So I retired, and that summer, I was asked by the University of Wisconsin-Waukesha to come and teach. The friend out there wanted to know if I'd come and teach part-time. And I figured I could do that. With ibuprofen, I could teach 2 days a week. So that's what I did for 8 years. I was going there for 2 years, and I ended up there for 8 years, teaching 2 days a week. And I enjoyed that experience. The students were not as enjoyable as teaching 8th graders. It was there was a little more of an apathy there and all that, but still.
Why was that? Were they just less engaged or
yes.
interested about?
It was, not all, but many of them were less engaged. Yes. Being a community college, a 2-year school, many of them were. But still, I got to keep teaching. I got still able to be in front of the students and try to get them to enjoy math. That was always my goal, to try to get them to really love math, which I think I did a pretty good job of. So that part of it was fine. But then, by the time I was 66, I said, you know what, I think it's time. I want to spend a little more time with my wife and with the grandkids and all. Yeah. So at that point, hung them up. So
do you ever miss teaching and wish you could go back at all? Or are you pretty much happy with your decision to?
My body tells me that with my knees and my shoulders and all that, I don't have to miss it anymore. As much as I really would love to be in a group, now and then I think I'd love to be in front of a group of students and go over some things with them and teach some things to come in as a guest speaker once in a while. I might like that, but on a day-to-day basis, not anymore.
Sure.
Yep.
So what do you do with your time now that you have all this free time on your hands?
Oh boy, it depends. We travel some. We like to cruise in the winter. We take little trips in spring and fall, sometimes in the summer with family. But other than that, it's just spending time with my wife. The days go by. I always say to my wife, how did we ever have time to work? I mean, I don't know. It seems the days do go by. The grandkids, that seems to be a little less now, but for a long time we were caring for grandkids during there, helping out with the grandkids. We don't do as much of that anymore. Yeah, you're welcome. We don't get to do as much of that anymore. But I think you get up a little later and you go to bed a little earlier. So the days are a little shorter anyway. We enjoy going to movies now and then. But getting things done around the house takes longer than it used to. Yeah. So, and I think we're just organizing things a lot more now, going through memorabilia in the house, in the basement, trying to decide if we're going to downsize someday. That's how the days go by. Yep.
So yeah, you talked a little bit about how you said you go on the cruises in winter, and I know you said with your brother-in-law Rich how you were out in Pittsburgh a lot.
Right.
Is there a favorite place that you have to visit, whether it be in the United States or anywhere in the world? Like, where's your favorite vacation destination?
Our favorite vacation of all time, I think I would say, was our trip to the Canadian Rockies. Glacier National and the Canadian Rockies. We took a train out to the Glacier National and then went up into the Canadian Rockies. The most beautiful place I've ever seen in my life. And I've seen a lot of places. The Canadian Rockies and Glacier National were by far the most beautiful.
Mm-hmm. So, family has seemed to be an underlying theme in this interview for you, so it only seems fitting that we end with a family question. So, what's it been like seeing your family grow and change and have new members be added to your family throughout the years? What has that experience been like for you?
Yeah, it's been amazing. I mean, it's been just amazing. To think that my first grandchild is graduating from Marquette High this year and going on to college. I got to be careful how I talk about that because that gets you right here. When I think about the day he was born and now that he's graduated from high school, it's just amazing. Each grandchild brings with it a new experience, a new refreshing moment in our lives. I mean, here we have one going to college, and then last year I had, after having a lot of grandsons in a row, we had my second granddaughter, and the joy of that day, just amazing, just amazing. My first granddaughter, when my daughter-in-law yelled out, "It's a girl!" I'll never forget it. As we walked in, after I had two sons, and then we had a couple of grandsons. They didn't think the Minessales could have granddaughters. So, and now to have a second granddaughter, but each one of them has a personality that's so unique, and you just want to spend as much time as you can with each one of them. I got to get careful how I talk about this because as you get older, you just want to make sure you've got to spend as much time as you can with each one of them. It's been awesome.
That's great.
Grandparents, great. And they go home at night most of the time.
Well, thank you for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you. This has been a unique opportunity, and I thank both of you for letting me be a part of this.
It was a wonderful opportunity for the both of us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.